I want to welcome everyone to our workshop today, Best Practices in Qualitative and Quantitative Data-Driven Decision-Making Lessons from the Field. Today's event is sponsored by American University's Measurement and Evaluation Program. At American University, we are committed to pursuing inclusive excellence. One of our practices shared from our Indigenous and Native communities is to offer a land acknowledgement at the beginning of our meetings and events. The goal is to build our mindfulness of the historical processes in which we still participate. American University is founded on the unceded land of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging these communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. American University also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. With this acknowledgement, we commit to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Those of you that regularly attend our events know that we always provide a land acknowledgement. I would encourage you today to take this a step further and to do some research on the land where you are sitting. If you're not aware of the history of the land, I will put some links in the chat where you can go ahead and look it up. Before we get started today, I would like to hear where you are joining us from. So if you can put it in the chat where you're joining us from, and I will go ahead and read that out. We have someone from Rockville, Maryland, Fairfax, Virginia, Matthews, North Carolina. Joining us from Maine, I'm very jealous of that one. Bethesda, Maryland, exciting place to be today. Charlottesville, Virginia, Amman, Jordan, Silver Spring, Maryland, Lockwood, California, Bethesda as well. We've got a lot of people coming from all parts of the US and the globe. Thanks very much for joining us. Our speaker today is Cytandra Hoover. Cytandra has spent 20 years developing models, collecting and analyzing complex quantitative and qualitative data in environments ranging from Fortune 100 companies to war zones. Her data modeling field experience spans locations as Colombia, Paraguay, Yemen, Libya, and Israel, where she tracked and quantified hearts and minds change management in conflict and natural disaster zones with entities including the United Nations. She is an SIS alum from American University, and before we got online today, we're talking about an international development class she was in my class 20 years ago. Fun stuff. Thank you very much, Cytandra, for leading this workshop today. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Very welcome. Yes, it was quite an honor to be invited to come back. I have nothing but positive memories from my experience at AU. So I think that one of the values of American is that ability to contribute back to the university. So I'm thrilled to be able to share my experiences, both in terms of what I learned from AU 20 some odd years ago, how I have used those practices throughout my career, and then being able to share that back with all of you in the hopes that that helps to contribute to your own futures. So to get started, as Bev said, my intent today is really to talk through some of my best practices in quantitative and qualitative data-driven decision-making and how I have used those and applied those both in the for-profit, nonprofit sector across the myriad of areas that I have worked in. If we were doing this live, I would be asking lots of questions to all of you. I'm going to ask them anyway, just for you to pontificate on as we're going through. So the first one I actually would want to start with is, do any of you have an idea on why I may have chosen these pictures as a background for this presentation? So I'll give you a moment to think about it. And the reason why is not only at the first may they appear to just be ocean pictures, I think they're very pretty to begin with, but if you start to actually analyze it, you would find that they actually are representatives of the Fibonacci sequence that appear in nature. And that, like data, is that as you look at different points of information, you'll see how patterns start to emerge. You'll find that there's the uniformity of distance between the stems, or the way that they grow. And that is like data, that at the very surface, they may appear completely unrelated. And it's not until you start to look at analyzed variables that you find that there actually is correlation between them. And that's where those patterns evolve from. I also am a big fan of the Fibonacci sequence, and I love the ocean. So I thought that that was a good component as well. So moving along, I will not go into details of my background, as Bev mentioned, but I really wanted to highlight what I have found to be 4 of the core areas that relate to data analysis, as well as how that then ties into monitoring evaluation. And that's really starting at the very beginning. That's understanding what it is that you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, selecting and looking at the data that you need to be able to do that, understanding the challenges and nuances regarding data integrity and governance, and lastly, then how you actually share and tell that story, because if you're only keeping it for yourself, it's not really providing that value. So how do you accurately and appropriately tell that story to be able to make as much impact as possible? Please feel free to ask questions along the way. So again, as Bev said, I'm not going to get into it. You can read it over on your own, or feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or any way I can help you all. So again, three key areas here. One is, again, feel free to ask questions as we go. You can use the raise your hand or the chat feature. I also like to use these as working sessions, as Bev said at the beginning. So if you have any current or real world examples or dilemmas that you are facing, please feel free to bring them up, and I'm happy to discuss them, and we can see what practices or ideas that we may be able to incorporate as we go through. I'll be asking again a few questions, kind of surveys. They will not be formal, but I will ask some of those questions to pontificate and get some ideas around what you would like to, how you can contribute to the presentation as well. So the very first one that I think is critical when you're looking at any kind of data analysis is really understanding what you're trying to solve. So looking at what is the question and goal, setting that stage from the very beginning. And I love this quote because I think it really highlights what the important part around data analysis really is it's not about looking at problem solving in terms of defining what the outcome is, but you really need to understand what the problem is that you are trying to get at. So if you don't know where you're going, any road will lead you there. You really need to set that stage very clearly from the very beginning, because if you don't bring in the right data points, you don't bring in the right type of analysis, you don't incorporate the right teams or individuals, you will get outcomes that might not lead to really what the outcome is that you are looking for. So with that in mind, looking at these questions and goals, one of the questions I have for all of you is, how many of you are looking at conducting analysis right now where you started at the very beginning, whereas perhaps maybe you're starting at the midpoint and you need to then backtrack and understand? So these are a few of the questions that I have pulled together that I think are really important to allow us to think about what to do depending on where you're starting. Again, if you're starting at the very beginning, it's asking about what problem you're trying to solve, what is the hypothesis that you are looking at, what factors or variables do you need to collect, what indicators are you looking for, is there a framework you're already working from, or is there something you need to build, what impact are you trying to make? What is the intended outcome that you are looking for? Do you already know what it is that you are trying to deliver, or are you trying to define that throughout the analysis? What information have you already collected? And that's a really important piece, because depending on what you already have, you then also need to understand what process and what approach was used to collect that data at the beginning. And then what are your data sources? As we all know, data integrity, and I'll talk about that later on as well, are a critical component to your analysis. Is your data source reliable? What assumptions were made to build that, to understand that? Do you need to recollect data, or do you need to verify it? Those are all really important questions to understand, to make sure that whatever it is you're going to analyze is based upon integrity, is based upon the information and the assumptions that are going to provide the outcome that you need to look at. If you're starting at the midpoint, which oftentimes is also the case, not only do I recommend looking at all of those questions, but then there are other pieces as well. And depending on what industry that you're in or what it is that you're looking for, you might actually then have to be doing a lot more work. So is there something you've already heard anecdotally? Is there someone, a key stakeholder in your process that is trying to sway the outcome of your analysis? Do you need to change or confirm that belief or your data? And that is oftentimes the case. There's already an assumption of what the outcome will be, and that desire to use data to prove or to disprove it. And that's where some of that real challenge in the storytelling, again, that we'll talk about later on, comes into play. How can you tell a story with data to either to change or to confirm what that belief is? And then lastly, how much education do you have to do? How much do you actually have to then explain to your stakeholders around what the topic really is? And that is a core piece as well, is there might be assumptions or beliefs around the topic you're looking at that are not entirely correct or not entirely accurate. So how much education do you need to do to change the framework of the conversation as it relates to the story that you're trying to tell and the analysis that you're trying to look at? So I want to use two real use cases. These are actual scenarios that I have gone through to depict and show the importance of asking those questions and understanding. So back in 2006, Columbia went through its first, actually technically in 2004, Columbia went through its first demobilization process with the AUC paramilitaries in Colombia. That was not with the guerrilla forces that were recently demobilized, but with the paramilitary forces. And there were about 56,000 paramilitary forces that then needed to be reinserted into Colombian society. So I worked on a UN-sponsored program with USAID, several other international agencies and governments to build out the program to help to reinsert these 56,000 demobilized ex-combatants back into Colombian society. This was the first time in the history of a demobilization when it occurred while the conflict was actually still continuing. So we did not have a precedent that we could use to build out what the monitoring and evaluation or the program setup needed to be able to successfully integrate these individuals back into society. We knew what services needed to be provided, but other than that, we really had to build it from the ground up. So that was us really starting at the beginning. And so many of those questions that I showed on that last slide were those questions that we were asking as we were trying to think about how to set up this program. So we offered services such as formal and informal education, healthcare, governance, family support, et cetera, many different services there. And so the critical part here was really thinking through, what do we need to monitor? How do we need to monitor it? What information do we need to collect? How do we collect it? And where and how do we then actually reach out to all of these 56,000 individuals to make sure that we have the program set up in the appropriate way so that we can connect with every individual, but then be able to aggregate it on a macro level. These are a few pictures from that demobilization, but those are actual examples of how we really needed to ask those questions from the very beginning to try to effectively set up a program to be able to monitor it through longevity. A second program, and on a very different scope and industry, is actually something that I'm recently working on right now. And that is, I have stepped into a role where we need to look at all the grantees and third-party relationships within the industry that we work in. We identified that we have over 200,000 grantees or payees, and they are all manually entered and manually tracked. It is all open text fields, no drop-down fields. And so within those 200,000, we don't know which ones are the same or which ones are different. It represents about $2 billion of spend and over 200 different services or programs that they each confirm. So here we are stepping into the middle after about 20 some odd years of implementation to need to go back through and clean it all up. This is then allowing us to really, again, reflecting back on those prior questions, now we're jumping into the middle. And now we need to not only change, the mentality and the thinking of how is the data organized of what is out there, but then really get down to the crux of how do we clean it up? How do we analyze this information? How do we group the right entities together? How do we make sure we know and understand where the duplicates are, so that we can make sure that those grantees, those third parties, are properly aligned with the services and then the amount of spend. So this is, again, one example right now in the midpoint where you need to ask different questions than if you're setting it up at the very beginning. The second area that I've mentioned is on selecting the data. So when you're really starting, ideally at the beginning, but at any point in time, it's really understanding what data do you need. And I put this question in here, or this comment in here, you can't measure what you don't know. I actually went back and forth quite a bit on, is the question you can't measure what you don't know, or is it that you don't know what you can't measure? And that's a really interesting point when it comes to data, is you really need to understand your data so that you can understand what you can and you cannot measure. There are two principal types of data. You have structured and unstructured data. Traditionally, structured data would be more aligned with your quantitative data, drop-down fields, structured information. It's clearly defined. You can easily search for it. And it's usually stored in what are called data warehouses in predefined formats. It's much more easy to be able to analyze and to look at. It's not always quantitative. You can certainly put qualitative data information in there, but it needs to be very clearly defined in terms of what that looks like and how you set it up from the very beginning. And I'll talk about some use cases on the next slide. Unstructured data, on the other hand, is usually open fields. There's very little limitation. It's stored in its native format, meaning that it's however the data was initially collected. There's very little structure, very little definition to it, and it requires a significant amount of interpretation to understand. It can include areas such as images or multimedia files, but it also can often be qualitative information, text fields, anecdotal information from a survey, and it's stored in what are called data lakes. So it's much broader, it's much more open, and it's in a variety of those formats. And then the challenge with those is really being able to analyze it, to interpret it, to understand how one source or one piece is connected to another one. Within that, then, it's selecting the data. I want to provide to you one example that I recently worked on for a survey that we were going to send out. For anyone who's brave enough, I would certainly love to hear your thoughts on reactions to this survey. This was the original structure that was set up for a qualitative survey that we wanted to send out to over 500 people. Was broken into two sections. The first question was going to be a checkbox, which just said, please select these areas where you experience pain points. And you can see those 5 items on the left-hand side. And then there was going to be a separate question following that just said, please identify where you experience it and provide details. So you can see the 5 areas and one large text box to be able to put put in information. Anyone brave enough to provide some ideas on why you think that this is or is not a very good qualitative survey? All right, so I'll provide my feedback then. So one critical part in developing a qualitative survey is the ability to tie information together so that you can analyze it. You have to be able to tie qualitative information to related areas so that it can be analyzed. So what that means is that if we're saying on a process area, we want people to say, here's process, and then it's a gigantic text field. How are you going to be able to separate out the information about those processes? There could also be areas where, for example, people might put it as process, but it's really about technology. So how are you going to separate out each one of those individual pain points? And again, because it's one single text field, someone could put in 10 different pain points into a single text field. But then how are you going to be able to break that down into 10 separate areas that need to individually be analyzed and individually be looked at? How can you then find if it's a pain point with process also relates to a pain point with technology? So it really is having something that's grouped in such a very broad, very high level would take an extraordinary amount of interpretation and analysis and text mining to be able to break this apart, to then determine really where those related areas are in terms of, to then be able to actually take action and know what are the areas that are of most significance, where are the biggest pain points. I think I saw a few comments come through. So Bev, I don't know if you want to read any of those off, and I can pause for a second.
Sure. Dory is saying that the respondents might not know what a pain point is. Maybe people will define pain point differently.
Yes.
Rachel mentions the follow-up question is significant to interpretation.
Absolutely.
And then to dovetail with that, Alexia says there's too much variability in the answers, and that you could do a multiple choice and also a free answer instead.
Yep. And those are all excellent points, and they're all completely accurate. And the part on interpretation and understanding is really critical. And depending on who your audience is, it's even more important if you're working with a broad range of participants and stakeholders, from whether it be different departments in a company or people who speak different languages or different cultural backgrounds. Understanding what you mean by each of those words is critical to your outcome. It also is critical to make sure you're phrasing the questions in the right way. You're all absolutely correct. So what we ended up doing, and I didn't put the final survey in here because we actually just released it, but what we ended up doing is breaking it down so that we had individual, first of all, we did put in very clear definitions of what we meant by each of the words in here. We also clarified what we were talking about. So what are you relating? What do you mean by pain points? What do you mean by experience? We changed words such as details. And we broke it down and had individual text boxes for each one of the responses that tied to each one of those categories. We received back over 600 responses. But it really is critical when you're talking about qualitative surveys to understand, define information as clearly as possible, make it as straightforward and clear as you can, and really to break things out and break things apart so that you can easily analyze it. You don't want to have multiple answers in one area. It's really important to break them apart, to have separate answers. If you think that there's going to be interrelatedness or connectivity, between different responses or different areas, you want to make that as easy for you to be able to analyze. So it's really being able to think through what that outcome is that you're looking for before you even build it. You want to know what it is that I am trying to look for. How do I want to get the information so that I can use it, so that I can analyze it before you even start to build it? And again, I'll talk more about that a bit, as well as in the storytelling part, as we're looking at, telling your data and telling your story. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your comments. So one other part then also that I mentioned at the beginning is around data integrity and governance. So few call outs here that I have really found that are critical throughout my experience in doing both quantitative and qualitative analysis. The first one that I'm sure you all know about, and I've even talked about it so much that my 7-year-old son repeats it as well, is correlation is not causation, right? That just because certain data points may appear to follow the same trend, whether it's relational or inverse, et cetera, that does not mean that there is causation. That doesn't even necessarily mean that they are actually related. And that's really critical. Again, when we're going back to, those first images at the beginning, when I was talking about those ocean pictures and being related to the Fibonacci sequence, is really being able to tease apart those different aspects and variables and elements of data and testing different data to see what is related, what is not related, really being able to try to get down to the root cause. So that's a really important part, is you don't want to jump to conclusions with data. Let the data tell the story. Don't jump ahead and prove your hypothesis or use confirmation bias within your data. You really want to let your data tell the story for you. And then that's really what then ties into that bias part, is do you have, and these are some of the questions that I think about a lot as we're going into data analysis exercises, is do you already have something in your mind, a bias that already exists, whether that is in terms of what you think the outcome will be or what you think the source is, before you even go into that analysis. So understand your own biases, the biases of those around you. Has someone already, as number 2 states there, has someone already fallen in love with a proposal? And that goes back to what I mentioned earlier on as well, is do you need to do some re-education? If someone has already fallen in love with a proposal or with a hypothesis or with an outcome, do you need to re-educate on really what that story needs to be able to open people's eyes and minds to a different outcome? And then I'm sure you all have spoken about this quite a bit already, is really about groupthink. Are there different opinions within the team? Are people following a view or a perspective because there's a louder voice in the room? What analysis has been done to really direct people in one direction or another? And so 4 areas that I think are really important to set yourself up for success as you are looking at data and you want to ensure that data integrity and governance, because oftentimes you'll start to create information and then and set up your analysis in a certain way. And then you'll collect additional information and you'll want to update that later on. It's really important that you document any assumptions, what your variables are, baselines that you used at the very beginning. So set those clear parameters at the very beginning so that you can re-pull the information and analyze it and look at it at a future point in time, and you know that you're accurately and appropriately comparing it to what you already did. Otherwise, you could be comparing the wrong information and seeing trends that occur that actually are not correct because you didn't state your definitions at the very beginning. A second part also, where especially if you're doing any kind of analysis, monitoring, and evaluation that needs to result in a recommendation, in a proposal, it's really important to engage your stakeholders early and frequently while you are building it out. You want to get that buy-in, you want to get that support from your stakeholders, whether that is a funder of a project, a donor, or anyone else that is involved in what the intended outcome of your effort is. You want to involve them early on to make sure that you really have their buy-in and their enthusiasm around what it is that you're analyzing. Another fun one is when you're combining data from multiple sources. I'm sure many of you have done that, and that's another critical piece, is you can't take information from various sources, even if the titles of those data are the same, and combine them together. It's really important to understand what are the assumptions, the definitions behind each one of those sources before you combine and aggregate data from multiple sources. You need to ensure that those definitions are the same. So when you say service or you say pain point, are we making sure that we're talking about the same thing? And again, just in summary, it's really document, document, document. Write it all down. Write down your assumptions, your understandings, your definitions. Make sure that you are using the same information, that everyone is on the same page, and that you're being able to then also replicate and duplicate it at a future point in time, so that you can make sure that you're analyzing the right information and being able to compare it. One question also for all of you, I want to ask you, and again, you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but just to think about, how many of you prefer to be billed and to pay your housing service providers, such as your cell phone, utilities, rent or mortgage, via electronic billing and auto pay functionality, versus manually receive your paper bills in the mail and then manually pay them by check or some kind of online process? And you may think that this has nothing to do with data analytics or monitoring evaluation, but it's actually a pretty fascinating case study. So just think through, what your individual preferences are and how you do that. So with that, this is an analysis that was done, and I think this is a great use case when combining both quantitative and qualitative data. This is a study that was done by the consulting firm Accenture several years ago, called the Money Mindsets. And what they realized is that people are broken up into 4 categories. There are people who are called these achievers. They really focus on their wealth accumulation. They frequently check their bank accounts, but everything is done digitally. Then you have explorers, these people who are, committed to digital, but they really like to have more information about their wealth. They usually, will do manual payments, but maybe they'll set up auto pay occasionally. And then there are balancers. They do not believe in digital. They want everything to be in paper. They will not auto pay. They want to receive their bills in the mail. And they'll usually and oftentimes pay by check. And then there's a 4th group called these experiencers. And they just want everything to be touchless. They don't want to touch it. They don't want to have to look at anything. They set it up and then they forget about it. And what is really fascinating to me about this mindset, so I actually applied this when I was working at Liberty Mutual within the finance department to think about how we can attract and work with our customers more closely. How can we meet our customers where they are? And so the question that we were really asking is, have you ever wondered why companies give price reductions for auto debit or electronic billing? And how can we attract customers and retain customers based on how they look at money? And what we realized is that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I'm sure all of you, have experience working with different vendors or suppliers where there's only one way to get it. You can only get it by mail and you can only pay by check. For those that are more digitally oriented, that becomes a significant pain point. And we've actually found that companies will lose customers because of how they set up billing and payment structures. And so again, this really pulls together that quantitative and qualitative information, because we really needed to be able to send those surveys out. We did A/B testing with our customers to be able to understand how people engage differently. We wanted to understand what our customers were hearing and what our customers were thinking. We had to clearly define and target what customers that we wanted to look at. And what we found when we came out of it was that using that auto debit and electronic billing functionality was really a way to be able to pocket our customers into different buckets and be able to then target them with more specific marketing information and reduce their own individual pain points along the way, just strictly and merely from the perspective of billing and payments, and increase retention of our customers, again, from just two areas like billing and payments. So something, again, that might not seem very applicable or related, but again, really an example that pulls together where the quantitative and qualitative elements and areas are and how important it is to ask those questions, conduct that analysis, have, standard baseline information to be able to reference back, to then be able to eventually set product policies and marketing information for a very large Fortune 100 company. So last area is data storytelling. So you've now spent all of this time collecting data, asking questions, setting and documenting information, ensuring that you don't have bias, engaging your stakeholders along the way. And you have finally come to the point of now having very clear outcomes, measured information that you want to present, and you're getting ready to tell your story. One critical area I think is incredibly important is thinking about how you want to tell your story before you actually start building anything. Who is your audience and what should they take away from it? Are you going to be showing and presenting this information in a PowerPoint presentation? Is it in an Excel directly? Is it in some other kind of dashboard? How are you going to show your information? You want to make sure that you have it really clear and understood on what is the message you are trying to convey before you start building it out. And then really, once you have that figured out, it's then thinking through, how do I sequence it and how do I present my information to be able to get that maximum impact and outcome that I'm looking for? So a few ideas that I have used as I'm building that structure is you really want to keep it as simple as possible. So you want it to be informed, you want it to be simple terminology, focus on the proposal. Is it a finding, a decision? What's the story you're trying to tell? And then actually sketching out what that storyboard or what that message is before you build it. The second part then is really on style. So what's the communication? What language do you want to use? How are you visually going to make the most desired response that you can? If you're doing a PowerPoint presentation, using the titles on your slide to tell the story and highlight those key activities and those key takeaways. How are you going to tell your story? How are you going to convey the information so that it really captures your audience attention and presents what it is that you are trying to tell and the response you're trying to elicit? Again, whether that's a proposal and you're just sharing information and you need a response, is this just on a finding, right? Where you have found something and you just need to give people what your finding is, or do you actually need a decision? Do you need someone to tell you something at the very end of it? And then lastly, when you actually do present it, how are you making sure that you can pre-sell that message? So that goes back to the engagement with your stakeholders early on. If you're inviting people to a presentation and they've never seen your content before, how does that then change how you're going to tell your story, how you're going to convey your message versus people that are informed and know about it? It goes back to that comment on definitions. If you're going to put highly technical information into a presentation, without anyone having an understanding of what that information is, you're going to lose them along the way. So you really need to make sure that your message is clear, that your language is clear, and that your audience will understand it. And then your delivery, right? How are you actually going to present it? Make sure you're prepared, that you engage your audience, and then you have your audience aligned to the message that you do want to tell, that you want to convey. So here are two examples of what, of recent engagements that I have done that really help to tell a little bit more of the story in terms of how you need to visually depict things depending on who your audience is. So if it's an executive audience with a few people and all you're doing is telling a story, you really want to keep it high level. Call out numbers, call out findings, very high level, very executive in nature. You don't want to get into details. It's really calling out what is most important to them. However, if you're doing something with a large cross-functional group, many people, many levels, not everyone has the same level of information, you'll need to put in more content. You're going to need to call out more examples. One important piece as well is making sure that you're tying any visuals to your content, meaning that your visuals really help to reinforce and to tell the story that you're trying to convey on your slide. Making sure that your information and your visuals, whether it's your graphs or any other kind of multimedia, really helps to tell that story, and it should all be very self-explanatory. So really being able to tie all those pieces together so that you don't spend all this time doing monitoring and evaluation, collecting analysis, documenting information, time and time to really understand your quantitative, your qualitative analysis, how to look at those differently, how to present those out, and then come to a point where you're actually now trying to tell it and you haven't depicted it and showed it, whether it's again in a PowerPoint or any other format, Tableau, etc. And then you lay it out and it falls flat because no one can understand what the content is. It needs to be self-explanatory, call out areas of critical importance so that people really understand what it is of the story that you are trying to tell, that you are trying to convey. So that really concludes the gist of what I wanted to go through, of what I wanted to share with you in terms of my own personal best practices and experiences that I use regularly for both quantitative and qualitative analysis, again, across this myriad of areas that I've worked in, whether it's in Yemen during the middle of Arab Spring, trying to provide educational support to communities, or working in large companies and trying to convince executive leaders on decisions that we need to make. So all of these tools are really extrapolable to any industry, to any role that you are in, and just a few of those areas I've listed out here that I think are really critical to be able to tell that story and pull all of those pieces together. Any questions or ideas, comments that I can provide to any of you?
Thanks very much for that. Lots of information. I'll let the attendees put some questions in the chat. Feel free to raise your virtual hand if you have something. Maybe from my standpoint, if you can elaborate on your check here, or on your point here, to check your biases. How do you go about doing that? Is it a constant process? What are some tips that you would suggest that we use for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one that I start with is, how much do I know about what it is that I'm doing before I even get started? So if it's an area that I have extensive experience in, that I've worked in a lot previously, it's really looking and understanding, what do I already believe the truth to be? So that last slide, for example, on billing and payments, this is where we are facing significant issues to really understand how our billing and processes work. So where I have checked my biases along the way is to ask myself, what is it that I believe already exists? How do I think that it's already set up, that it's structured? What data do we already have that makes me think that this is the right direction to go in? And then as we collect more information along the way, making sure that I'm not putting my own individual judgment onto what that outcome is, but really double checking it to make sure, am I appropriately looking at this new information against what I already know? I think something that's also really important whenever possible is to have more than one person looking at the analysis. That's also another area where I think it helps to keep your biases in check, because different people join the conversation from different perspectives. And so being able to look at those biases from different people's perspectives is also important to make sure that you're analyzing the data correctly.
There's a question that's popped up in the chat. At what key time points are you checking in or engaging with stakeholders? From Isabel.
I do it frequently throughout. So I make sure that at the very beginning that I have checked in with my stakeholders in terms of aligning on what the outcome is. I think that's also really important, especially if you're doing an analysis and some kind of work that is intended to result in an outcome and a specific decision. So whether it's a policy or a business decision, you want to make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of what it is that you're trying to get out of it. That's not meaning that you set your hypothesis, your analysis to confirm your bias, but it just means that you're really clear on what it is that you're trying to get out of the analysis. And so I check in with my stakeholders regularly throughout. I do it at the very beginning to make sure that we're all on the same page of what it is that we're trying to achieve, making sure that we're asking the right questions. And then as I progress through my analysis and I have initial findings, I usually have a small working group of people that we then check in with and say, here's what we found. Let's check what were our assumptions, what data points did we use? Does this align with kind of what our thinking is, or is it very different? And just checking in along the way. Do we need to look at other variables? Did we run the analysis in the correct way? And just checking in with those stakeholders along the way, especially if they're going to be decision makers that are your stakeholders.
Couple of different questions from the chat from Sam. Could you give some examples of the questions and goals you are defining at the beginning?
Sure. So for example, right now we are doing a project where we need to understand the billing. And again, this is just the most relevant one in my mind, so I'm going to use this one. We need to understand how the process works for income of a bill and the payment of it for over 200,000 payees that we have, or grantees essentially. And so what we needed to do was then narrow that down to understand what can we start with that is manageable, that is understandable? How can we break this into core areas that we can piece apart to then be able to analyze individually rather than trying to take it as a whole collective area? And so it's really starting at that very beginning and understanding the outcome of this is we need to improve how we do something today. We need to make sure that we improve how the process is. It needs to be more streamlined. Or we need to have better customer service. It needs to be auditable. Many different areas along those way. And those are all the questions that we're asking ourselves at the very beginning to make sure that we really understand what our outcome is at the end. And so there can be different outcomes that you need. Maybe it's about you need to understand what kind of educational service you need to provide in a community. You're going to focus on education, but do we need to focus more on elementary school level education, or is it higher ed? And so as you collect your information, you're then being able to analyze, well, where is the greatest need? What is the community saying? Is the challenge of an outcome that there is not job availability and opportunity? Or is it that the community needs just basic information or basic education? So it's really trying to understand really what is that outcome on why are you doing the analysis to begin with? Why are you doing it, and who is asking you to do it, and why? It's really just asking those why questions.
And Dory has a really interesting question. What are your thoughts on collecting data in cultural contexts that are very unfamiliar or different from your own? Do you think it's ever beneficial to have a cultural outsider do an evaluation, or that research would generally be better conducted by someone from within the cultural context being studied?
I think it's critically important. I spent the first 10 years of my career all international, mostly in conflict, war, and natural disaster zones, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, etc. So that is a critical question that we ask all the time. What I have found are practices that we have used is you need to have both. So again, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier on using the right language. So that is also important, especially when you're trying to collect qualitative information in cultures and environments dissimilar to your own, is you have to make sure you're using the right language, the right terminology, but then you're also asking it in the right way. In many cultures, you cannot ask questions directly. You need to ask the same question, but it has to be asked in 3, 4, 5 different ways, or 3, 4, or 5 different steps along the way to be able to get to the ultimate answer you're looking for at the end. So I always recommend, always, having someone who speaks the local language, who is from the local culture, to be able to build and understand it. And oftentimes it's really that translation of what you're trying to collect and what you're trying to get out. So if what you're trying to understand is, healthcare services that are needed in rural Afghanistan, if you just go into a community and you ask the people point blank, well, what healthcare do you need? Do you have enough primary care? You're not going to get the answers that you look for, because the terminology that you're using, the way that you're phrasing the question, is not culturally sensitive and is not terminology that most of those communities would understand. So you have to have someone who understands that local context to really translate that into what it is that your intended outcome is. So it could be something like, do you use midwives in your community? Do you have, health healers or spiritual leaders? Do your children often get sick? Different ways of asking the questions. And then oftentimes you'll need to then aggregate multiple responses together to get to one single answer that you're really looking for. But you have to ask it in multiple different ways to then be able to aggregate it together to find the answer that you're really looking for.
Do you have, from David, how did the program in Colombia promote de-escalation of the conflict while it was still in progress? How did the program avoid looking like a one-sided propaganda tool?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I can certainly address the first one. So the first part of it was one of the critical areas that we looked at was where the demobilized ex-combatants were located within Colombia. So they were spread all across the country. We had 32 different regional field offices. And one of the things that we did to be able to make sure that they were not reuniting as a single force to then create conflict again was what we had was a tracking process where they needed to request if they wanted to move location. So whether that was within the same jurisdiction of that regional office or from one regional office to another one. And so we were then actually able to track and determine, were people from the same former paramilitary blocks trying to move to areas around the country so that they would then be reunited under and near the area of where their former leaders were. We actually found out that it was starting to happen. And that was actually one of the areas of analysis that I was in charge of, which was pretty fascinating. And what we did find was that people were starting to move back to the areas of where their former commanders were located. And we then needed to create intervention programs to move people back around, or to prevent them from moving, to try to find job opportunities for them of where they were, so that we could then attempt to reduce the impact and reduce that possibility, that desire to rejoin the armed conflict. And what was the second? The second question was about propaganda.
How did the program avoid looking like a one-sided propaganda tool?
So I don't know if I can address that directly. What I can say, though, is the way that the program was built was with many international entities, with the UN, with the Colombian government, but then also working very closely with NGOs and local community leaders on the ground across Colombia. So that this was not just a demobilization, you need to now be forced back into Colombian society, but working with victims groups and working with community leaders and building out communication materials and building out community engagement, so that we really could be taking that approach that this is what Colombia wants. This is what the Colombian people want. This is not about the US government intervening and telling Colombia what to do.
Do you have a preference for any particular data visualization tool, or do you use Excel?
I often use Excel I use Excel for most of my analysis. There are several other tools that I frequently like to use. Power BI is one of my favorite dashboards for visualization. And if you are putting something into a PowerPoint deck, a tool called ThinkCell is one of my favorites. It's an add-in into PowerPoint. You can get, free licenses, for short-term uses as well. But ThinkCell is a great way to put analysis, visuals, graphics into a PowerPoint presentation that don't just look like a screenshot.
All righty. Any other final questions? What is that called? How do you spell it?
ThinkCell, just like it sounds. Think and cell, C-E-L-L, like a cell in Excel.
So think, T-H-I-N-K, cell, C-E-L-L.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for leading this workshop today. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us and for helping us better understand data-driven decision-making. We learned a lot from your experiences and your reflections.
Absolutely. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks very much. We are taking the month of August off from our workshops. Our next noontime Eastern workshop will be on September 15th. Essentials for Evaluation Entrepreneurship, with certificate alum and Masters of Science in Measurement and Evaluation faculty member, Dr. Nina Sabari. Check your email in the coming days for that particular invite. Thank you very much, Cytandra. Great to reconnect with you and to learn from you today.
Likewise. Thank you all very much. Have a good summer.
Thank you.
Bye.